Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
A longstanding framework meant to root out inadvertent discrimination in hiring assessments will no longer be required for agencies. An interim final rule that OPM issued last week eliminates the uniformed guidelines on employee selection procedures from federal personnel policy and regulations. The move aligns with a June opinion from the Department of Justice, which deemed the framework for hiring assessments unconstitutional. Federal News Network's Drew Friedman breaks down what the changes will mean with the Partnership for Public Service's Jenny Mattingley.
This framework was created back in the 70s. It's another one of these things that sort of 70s and 80s came up around how do businesses and the government, because it's both a public and private sector thing, how do you select employees for jobs and what types of tests or exams or assessments can you use to ensure that they don't have disparate impact, so that they aren't biased. They aren't biased against somebody in terms of this for race, religion, national origin, all of those things. So that rule was created in place because there were a bunch of court cases back in the 70s and 80s claiming that exams, like the civil service exam was one for federal employment, were biased. And so this rule, basically uniform guideline on employee selection procedures, which again, there's no good acronym for that. That's where this came from, was to try to put into place some framework for public and private sector to say assessments need to be valid and validated to ensure that they aren't biased against any one group of individuals.
I guess noting that it is for all employers, not necessarily just agencies, but can you give maybe some context of, is this something that has been successful over time? Have agencies or other employers been able to either identify or eliminate bias as a result of having that framework?
I think, yes, as a broad field, the field of assessments and, how we look at candidates for whether it's through structured interviews, through resumes, through technical assessments, that field has drastically changed since the 70s. And a lot of it was because of some of those lawsuits and others, was how do you actually build both a field of professionals who know how to create valid assessments, and then how do you just build better assessments that aren't biased and that really are looking at the technical expertise. And my understanding from IO psychologists and others who have worked in this field is that we've really come a long way in terms of the types of assessments that are out there. Now, that being said, part of the reason we've come a long way is because there was a framework in place ensuring that was at least a criteria or a thought of companies, and that candidates who felt like they had been unfairly impacted or the assessment that they had to take was biased, had a mechanism to actually question, through the EEOC, the hiring practices of an organization.
So just going chronologically here, there was a DOJ opinion in June that essentially is calling this framework unconstitutional. When you saw that opinion come out, I'm just curious, what was your reaction or response to the way that they framed their argument there?
I was surprised that that we were looking at I guess that anybody was looking at the uniform guidelines on assessments, because it is a much more technical sort of thing that's usually been in the realm of either EEO professionals or HR professionals. We certainly touched on knowing what the rules were when I was working on SMEQA and all the hiring, skills-based hiring in government. And nobody had, that claim had not been raised before. In fact, one of the principles, again, was that everybody's using fair assessments that judge people's skills. And so I was a little surprised that this has become an issue that's out there. But I do also think that, yes, the law itself needs to be modernized, but it's another case of where they're, instead of maybe modernizing a law from the 70s, 80s, it's being wiped off, usage altogether. And so I do think there's a moment to step back and say, how might we continue to update this law, but still maintain the principles of fair, equal opportunity for anybody looking for applying for jobs?
But just, considering the context of what has actually happened here most recently is with OPM's interim final rule on this that looks specifically at taking these out of federal hiring processes. What do you see as the impact of that being for, how agencies conduct recruitment now?
I think it's less recruitment. It's more about what types of assessments they can or can't use. Now, I will say that, agencies, and we've talked about this before with skills-based hiring, I think the immediate impact is that agencies still aren't even using assessments to their full potential and capability. So I'm not sure people will see any immediate impact from this. What I do wonder, though, is that by removing sort of this guideline that assessments need to be fair, particularly in the age of AI, where there are questions about AI being biased, do we see a movement towards AI assessments of candidates that have bias built into them, whether even unintentionally people are questioning that about AI? So I do think it potentially opens the door and removes guardrails from going down that road. I would just go back to saying that agencies that have IO psychologists, and that's not many, it's a very niche skill set, but IO psychologists understand how to create assessments, how to make sure assessments are valid. Even without the framework, if you had a robust HR team that had HR folks who understand this type of work, IO psychologists who can build credible, fair assessments, the framework is still important. And you also do have better assessments if you have those things in place. And that those elements aren't what agencies have. And I don't see OPM yet helping agencies figure out how to get there. So my one hope would be, if they are removing some of these sort of frameworks and guardrails, that they are equally focused on resourcing agencies to do assessments well.
Jenny Mattingley is Vice President of Public Policy and Stakeholder Engagement at the Partnership for Public Service. She's speaking there with Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. You can find Drew's story at federalnewsnetwork.com.